Hello, everyone, and welcome. I hope everyone is doing as well as possible. My name is Catherine Spellman-Poots, and on behalf of Columbia's Middle East Institute, I would like you to be welcome to today's event, Palestine and Lebanon after October 7th, examining the social and spatial impacts of a regional war. I'd first like to thank our co-sponsors, the Center for Palestine Studies here at Columbia, as well as the Center for the Study of Muslim Societies, also at Columbia, and our friends at Brown University, the Center for Middle East Studies. So thank you very much for your support. And a special thanks to everyone at these centers who have worked really hard to make this event happen in a very short amount of time and under some really difficult and stressful circumstances. So a warm thank you to everyone. Now, in light of the ongoing crisis and the catastrophic violence, it felt essential to bring this panel of scholars together, who do not only have a deep historical knowledge of the region, but also are closely attuned to the social and political realities on the ground. So thank you so much for participating, and I'm really happy that we pulled this together. The language that is often used to describe the ongoing violence, such as targeted, limited, precise, stands in stark contrast to the shocking scale of civilian deaths and the displacement of millions, and the widespread destruction of critical infrastructure, as well as just basic needs that people need to survive. So as civilians bear the brunt of this devastation, today's discussion will center on the social and spatial impacts of the war in Palestine and Lebanon. Now, in terms of format, I'll start by introducing the panelists, and then I'm going to ask each of them to respond to an overarching question, and each panelist will have 7 or 8 minutes to answer that question. And then I'll ask more specific questions that are catered to the area of specializations of each panel member. And then we'll have a discussion, and we really welcome your questions. So please do put your questions into the chat box, and we'll do our very best to engage with as many as we can. And yeah, we'll definitely reserve the final 30 minutes, and if not more, for the wider discussion. Okay, so I'd like to first introduce, I think I'll go in terms of alphabetical order here. Professor Lara Deeb is the Laura Vausbinder Hawkett Endowed Chair and Professor of Anthropology and Middle East North African Studies at Scripps College in the Claremont Consortium. Her most recent book, which is published this fall, is called Love Across Difference, Mixed Marriage in Lebanon. Professor Deeb has also, she's published a lot, but 2 books based on research in the southern suburbs of Beirut include An Enchanted Modern Gender and Public Piety in Shi'i Lebanon, and that was with Mona Harb, as well as Leisurely Islam, Negotiating Geography and Morality in Shiite South Beirut. She's also co-authored MEREP's recent primer on Lebanon, and in case people do not know about MEREP, it's the Middle East Research and Information Project. So welcome, Laura. And next, I'm happy to introduce Professor Elias Muhanna, who is Associate Professor of Comparative Literature and History at Brown University, and is also the new director of the Center for Middle East Studies. He is a scholar of classical Arabic literature and Islamic history, and his essays and criticism appear regularly in mainstream press, including the New York Times, the London Review of Books, the New Yorker, The Nation, and many other periodicals. So a very warm welcome to you, Elias. And not last but not least is my friend Ali Musleh, who is the Ibrahim Abu-Luqad Fellow at the Center of Palestine Studies here at Columbia, where he is working very hard on his manuscript, To What Abyss Does This Robot Take the Earth?, which explores the automation of settler colonial warfare. And his forthcoming piece with Professor Jonathan Beller, The Question of Genocide, will be published in Social Text in December this year. So I think we'll now turn to the overarching question. Laura, I'm going to start with you. So since intensifying its war against Hezbollah in Lebanon in late September, Israeli forces have been deploying some of the same devastating tactics that it has used and continues to use in the ongoing destruction of Gaza. So how does the scale of this current crisis, I think you're going to focus mainly on Lebanon, but in Gaza and Lebanon, compare to past conflicts in the region in terms of humanitarian impact, the displacement of so many people, and the local and regional instability and solidarity?
Thank you, Catherine. And that's a huge question, but also thank you to both you and Elias for organizing this event, which of course joins the ever-growing list of events we all wish were very unnecessary. I'm going to start with two related points that I'll show through a condensed timeline of Israeli attacks on Lebanon and say also a few words about the Dahya Doctrine, and that's going to get me to answer the question that you just posed. The first point is that just as this genocide in Gaza, during which at this point the Israeli military has killed at least 42,000 Palestinians and likely hundreds of thousands, just as it did not begin last October, Israeli violence against Lebanon, which today, as of today, has killed at least 2,500 people, did not begin last October, nor did Israeli violence against civilians in either place begin with the founding of Hezbollah in 1984 or Hamas in 1987, right? It all begins with the Israeli state's inception. And then the second point picks up on something Catherine just said in her intro, that again, just as we have seen in Gaza, the Israeli state consistently describes their attacks in Lebanon as precision strikes targeted towards specific people or groups, while actually targeting civilians regularly. And again, this is something it has done for decades. It's not new. So during the Nakba in October 1948, months after Israel unilaterally declared its existence, Israeli armed forces crossed into Lebanon. They crossed the border and occupied 14 Lebanese villages in the south, a part of South Lebanon that includes the Litani River's waters and is part of the Greater Israel Designs. And then during armistice negotiations, the border was returned to the original line, and the Israeli state, they agreed to this because it was pragmatic for all of the negotiations they were in at the time. And so the Israeli troops withdrew. But during that period in October, a unit of the military massacred all the civilians remaining in the Lebanese village of Hula, which is a village that has again come under attack recently. Some 50 civilians who had not already fled. They locked them in a building and blew the building up on top of them. And so that's, I'm giving this much detail to show, again, that since 1948, we've been seeing these kinds of tactics. Then during the Lebanese Civil War, which began in 1975, Israeli troops invaded Lebanon twice. In 1978, they invaded the south. And now my second point about the dissonance between the Israelis' stated goals and the actual targets of violence comes in. They claimed that their goal was to stop the PLO from firing rockets from South Lebanon into Palestine, into occupied Palestine, and the PLO had been operating from South Lebanon, right? But over the 2 weeks of that invasion, Israeli troops killed nearly 2,000 Lebanese and Palestinians, mostly civilians, and they displaced 250,000 people. In 1982, Israeli troops invaded again, all the way to Beirut, and put West Beirut under a devastating siege, right? So for 3 months that summer, they cut off civilians' access to water, electricity, and food, and regularly bombed Beirut. And again, stated intention, the removal of the PLO or the targeted assassination of a PLO leader or the destruction of PLO infrastructure. Again, that invasion and siege killed approximately 20,000 people, mainly civilians. And it was also during that invasion that the Israeli army provided cover for the right-wing Lebanese Maronite militia, the Lebanese forces that was allied with them to massacre thousands of Palestinian and Shia Muslim civilian refugees in the Sabra and Shatila camps in Beirut. So Hezbollah was formed after these Israeli invasions, right? It comes into being to fight the Israeli occupiers and just wouldn't exist in this form without them. Then when the Israeli military withdraws from most of Lebanon in 1985, it continues to occupy about 10% of the south, both with Israeli troops and by relying heavily at times on a proxy Lebanese militia. During that occupation, which lasted 22 years, the Israeli military attacked civilians and civilian infrastructure multiple times. So in 1993, over 100 civilians were killed over 7 days. In 1996, 1999, and 2000, Israeli warplanes destroyed power plants. In 1996, there was a campaign called Israeli military campaign called Grapes of Wrath. And on April 18th of that year, the Israeli forces bombed a United Nations bunker in Ghana, where 800 civilians had taken refuge, killing 106 and injuring 116 Lebanese and 4 Fijian UNIFIL soldiers. So I'm mentioning that detail because right now is also not the first time they attack United Nations personnel. The occupation ended in 2000 because the resistance led by Hezbollah had made it too costly for the Israeli state. And then you have a period of relative calm. And then in 2006, the Israeli state launched a 33-day war on Lebanon on a scale that had been unseen since that 1982 invasion, right? And again, stated goals, this time to disarm and remove Hezbollah from South Lebanon. What actually happened? Israeli airstrikes with naval support and a ground invasion killed over 1,000 Lebanese, mostly civilians, and displaced 500,000 people. 500,000 people also, just for context for those who aren't familiar, that's what? A tenth of Lebanon's population? An eighth of Lebanon's population? It's a lot of, it proportionally a significant amount of the population. That Israeli attack also caused $3 billion of infrastructural damage. Again, like we're seeing today, they flattened entire villages in the south, whole neighborhoods in the southern suburb of Beirut, and focused the destruction on things like roads, bridges, power plants, sewage treatment facilities, wheat silos, a dairy factory. So really civilian infrastructure. And the Israeli general that was in charge of the Northern Command at that time, his name was Gadi Eisenkot, he actually named this level of destruction the Dahia Doctrine, after the southern suburb of Beirut, which is known as Dahia, which just means suburb in Arabic, and there's a history of that. Eisenkot, this Israeli general, explained that the Dahia Doctrine explicitly called for the massive disproportionate use of force on civilian infrastructure, right? And stated that the Israeli military views civilian villages, buildings, and other infrastructure categorically as military bases. Now, it's worth noting that, of course, 2006 was not the first time that the Israeli military had targeted civilians and civilian infrastructure. The entire history of Israeli colonization in Palestine demonstrates that. But this is the first time that a general names it in the press as an explicit strategy, at least that I know of. So the Dahia Doctrine then governed not only the 2006 Israeli war on Lebanon, but also the multiple devastating Israeli attacks on Gaza since 2008. And at first glance, many of us thought this was the doctrine that was governing the current Israeli genocide on Palestinians in Gaza that we've been witnessing for the past year and the current Israeli war on Lebanon. But I said at first glance because, again, we don't have any new direct quotes about a new doctrine from Israeli generals like we do for the Dahia Doctrine. But several journalists and scholars, including Tuful Abu Habayb, have pointed out, and I think they're right, that since last October, the Israeli war plan that under the Dahia Doctrine kills civilians by targeting civilian infrastructure has actually expanded significantly to target civilians themselves. So now we have to talk about a Gaza Doctrine. So in 2006 in Lebanon, for the most part, people were able to stay alive by evacuating certain parts of the country. That is not the case today in Lebanon. And it's also certainly not the case in Gaza and has not been. So instead, what we see with this new war machine, or this new incarnation of the Israeli war machine, is an explicit targeting of people, ranging from leaders to absolutely indiscriminate targeting, like the pager attacks in Lebanon, hospitals in both Lebanon and Gaza, refugee tents, designated alleged safe zones, and this genocide within a genocide that we've all been witnessing in North Gaza for the past many days. And this Gaza Doctrine, I think we have to understand it as enabled by the impunity with which the Dahia Doctrine was allowed to destroy Lebanon in 2006 and Gaza multiple times since 2008, which then begs the question of where the impunity with which Israel carries out a genocide today leads us in the future. So to circle back, I'll wrap up, to circle back to the question of scale that you posed, scale compared to past conflicts. What we've seen this past year in Lebanon and Gaza is exponentially larger in terms of death and destruction. And it is a continuation of Israeli policies of ethnic cleansing of Palestinians and a continuation of the Nakba. And it was enabled by the impunity with which Israel has been deploying violence on civilians and civilian infrastructure since its inception. So all of those things I think are true. So that's where I'll pause for now. There's obviously a lot more to say, but I'd like to hear from Ali and Elias.
Yeah, thank you for that historical backdrop and linking it to the present. Ali, please.
Hi. Well, first, thank you, Catherine, for invitation to talk to Lara and Elias and for organizing this event, all of the people who put effort into this. As Lara put it, the war on really Palestine and Lebanon began very early on with the beginning of the settler colonial operation, which culminated in the Israeli state, and continued later on in different forms of warfare. Gaza itself is a product of 1948 and the massive displacement of Palestinians in 48 and 49, from 47 actually to 49, that led to the destruction and of about 500 towns and villages in Palestine, the expulsion of the majority of the Palestinian people, and in many cases, their concentration in very small territories in order to open land for settlement. Gaza itself is about 1.3% of the entire landmass of historical Palestine. And in that small piece of land lives now about a third of the Palestinian people who live between the river and the sea. In the last estimate, it was between 2.2 to 2.4 million people who live in Gaza, one of the most densest population areas on Earth. Now, the displacement and concentration of Palestinians in that small piece of land was not a one-off, experiment or process. It's something that continued later on as a form of governance of Gaza. And this form of governance went on to basically kind of enclose Palestinians within what Ze'ev Jabotinsky called an iron wall of weapons that would basically make them basically submit, right, to the fate that was dictated to them by this project and by its leaders, by its ideologues, by the settlers. And because of that, Gaza has always experienced Israeli violence that was always modulated between counterinsurgency and really wars of annihilation. That's the history of Gaza, because Gaza was always really is a place where, let's say, Palestinian ethos of refusal was formed. Refusal of settler colonialism, refusal of subjugation, refusal of displacement, of dispossession, refusal of living under this form of cruelty that extends for decades now. All these processes of counterinsurgency, of wars of punishment, the Israelis transformed them really into technical processes where, you see violence every day being committed against Palestinians there, either to maintain the borders of Gaza, whether to control really the caloric intake of Palestinians, to control who goes in and out, what goes in and out. And all of it really is to reduce the Palestinian capacity to defend themselves, to organize, to free themselves from occupation and siege and so on. The period between 1948 and 1967 was really a period of concentration and monitoring. Surveillance mechanisms were set up in order to monitor the population, sometimes to maintain a frontier between Gaza and what became then the Israeli state. Israeli units would come in the same way that Lara was talking about, just would come in to maintain like this open frontier, massacre people, and leave. In 1967, that fluid border became also really a way of organizing a new form of invasion where Israelis would bring in now settlers, right, to settle into Gaza. So this little piece of land, really the 1% of Palestine that was left in the south, was also subjected to a form of settler colonial invasion. Settlers were brought in, settlements were built, and really during that period, about 1 million people were under the rule of 8,000 settlers, really, who lived there, kind of frontier settlers. They were living kind of frontier fantasies. Frontier homicide was a usual occurrence. The displacement of people, the maximization of territory for appropriation was always something that the settlements were organized around. The presence of the army there also made sure that the settlements would continue to flourish. More land would be taken. Any resistance would be crushed. With the beginning of the 21st century, Gaza was able to organize, and resistance in Gaza was able to organize in such a way as to really push the Israelis, or let's say make the cost of the occupation and settlement of Gaza too high for the Israelis to maintain their settler colonial frontier there. During that period, about Second Intifada, which began in 2000 and continued to 2005, 5 years almost, about 3,300 Palestinians were killed and 1,000 Israelis were killed. And that cost is really too high for any settler colony. Settler colonies cannot be established by maintaining any kind of, let's say, parity between, colonizer and colonized. The cost of settlement has to be low. This cost of warfare has to be low. So, which means that any, settler colonies require wars that look more like hunts rather than duels. In order to engineer that kind of relationship, the Israelis had to leave Gaza in 2005, and they engineered a form of enclosure and a form of occupation that would allow them to kind of, change this, let's say, ratio. These are the terms they use. One of the engineers of the occupation of Gaza post-2005, which was, by the way, called the separation plan and known generally as the disengagement plan, was Yoav Gallant, who before that was the head of Southern Command in the 90s. In the early 2000s, he was consultant to Ariel Sharon, who took on this project of the separation plan. Really, his designs included one, the decrease of the ratio of death from 100 Palestinians to 100 to an Israeli. That was part of his plan. The second thing is that Palestinians in Gaza would have really no options other than to basically flee, submit, or die. Of course, there's no place to flee.
Ali, just to give you I want to give Elias a chance to talk too, so if you could.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Thank you.
Just to close, there's no place to flee. And really, what we see today is an articulation and intensification of these logics of siege that end up becoming really moving from a sort of rational genocide to really a full-blown war of annihilation that is killing tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Elias, straight over to you.
Yes, thanks, Catherine, and thanks everybody who helped put this event together. I'll try to be very brief, just to leave plenty of time for conversation. Can you hear me okay? Okay, great. So just I'll focus on Lebanon. I think it might be helpful just to put some of the raw numbers out there so people know what's going on, people who aren't following that conflict very closely, which Lara already alluded to. About 2,500 people killed, according to Lebanese Health Ministry figures, and close to 12,000 people injured. And then on the displacement figures, the latest numbers right now are suggesting a displaced population, a Lebanese internal displacement of 1.3 million people. This is in a population, in a country with a population of 5.5 million, which includes 1.5 million Syrian refugees, people who were made refugees by the Syrian civil war, who have been in Lebanon for several years now. And 500,000 Palestinian refugees who have been, many of whom have been in Lebanon since 1948. So when you add those numbers together, we're talking about 3.3 million people in a country of 5.5 million internally displaced. Over half of the population is not living at home, not living in their homes. Lebanon before October 7th was suffering what the World Bank referred to as one of the three worst economic crises the world has seen since 1850. So this is before October 7th. The country's ability to address displacement, the severe shortages of food, of the impact on the infrastructure, environmental degradation, was already severely limited because of this economic crisis, the currency crisis, banking crisis in Lebanon. Since November 2022, Lebanon has had no president. The previous president's term ended, and the existing political powers have not been able to agree on his replacement, Michel Aoun's replacement. They have not been able to elect a president. That has led to the fact that in Lebanon, when the president is elected, he or she appoints a prime minister who then forms the government. Therefore, no president means no government. We have had a caretaker government now since then. Caretaker government's powers are necessarily limited. And so there's all kinds of things that have not been able to happen. No appointments of senior military officials, no appointments of senior banking officials, no inability to implement the kinds of reforms that the international community is asking Lebanon to make on the financial level. No ability to address pressing social issues like unemployment, the deep power cuts, and of course, to ameliorate the conditions of Lebanese living below the poverty line. That number has tripled in the past 10 years. The number of Lebanese living below the poverty line in 2012 was 12%. In 2022, it was 44%, and it's probably risen since then. Okay, so let's look at after October 7th. And specifically in the past month, what has happened? We have, as I said, 1.3 million people displaced from mainly the south, but also Dahieh, the southern suburbs of Beirut, where there have been hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of airstrikes, accompanied by the ominous, not all accompanied by warnings, but the warnings are no less terrifying. I've heard anecdotally, about people who work with relatives of mine who live in Lebanon, who have gotten those calls, who've gotten the calls saying, evacuate the building that you live in is near a Hezbollah target. And then half an hour later, they find out their building is gone, their house is gone completely. And these stories are very common. So what we have seen is that the government shelters are completely full. They're overwhelmed. The hospital system is overwhelmed. The doctors and nurses and paramedics are doing just heroic work. across the country trying to respond to these health issues. Because we have to remember, when the IDF issues a communique to people to leave their village or leave their building, and then proceeds to destroy the building or the village. In cases, the New York Times reported 2 days ago about the destruction of a village in southern Lebanon. When those calls come in and people leave with their families, they're leaving with health conditions. They're leaving. There are pregnant women. There are people with diabetes. There are people who have cancer who are now sent someplace else in the country and have to manage all those issues for we don't know how long. I mean, their homes are gone in many cases. So we're now looking at a crisis that this government or this country is going to have to face, and it's just it's mind-boggling how we're going to be able to address this, given the status of Lebanese dysfunction at the governmental level. On a happy note, I'm a political junkie, Lebanese political junkie. I am constantly glued to the TV watching the news and the political talk shows, and it has been heartening to see people across the country, in light of the fact that that the government shelters are full. We've seen people across Lebanon opening up their homes, schools, mosques, playgrounds, stadiums, private homes to welcome in the displaced. Just an example, my ancestral village, or one of my ancestral villages, Deir al-Ahmar in the North Bekaa, which is a primarily Christian village of about 23,000 people, has received 14,000 displaced people, primarily from the Baalbek Hermel area. And those stories abound. And so on the one hand, these scenes of sort of cross-communal solidarity project some hope and optimism that Lebanon will be able to withstand the crisis. On the other hand, there are real questions about how long this solidarity is going to be able to last. If the crisis continues and continues and continues, it's understandable that there's going to be inevitable personal conflicts that arise from these conditions. We saw a couple days ago, there was a much documented scene in Hamra, a neighborhood of Beirut, where the police arrived to clear a building that was full of folks who were displaced, who didn't want to go to the crowded shelters. The building was mostly empty because people had left, or, not abandoned. It was private property, but people weren't living there at the time. So there were displaced people there, and the police came in and said, we can't have the situation, it's private property, and tried to move people to the shelters, and a conflict broke out, where people were throwing rocks and stuff, and these kinds of scenes are going to continue. So
Elias, just to finish up.
Yeah, I think, why don't I stop there and we can discuss more.
Okay, thank you all very much for providing that backdrop, both the historical, but also the different scale, and understand the continuity, but also the extent of the damage that's taking place now, and how there are some differences as well. So I'd like to have some more pointed questions based on your different areas of specialization. Lara, if I could start with you, please. Much of your work, which I've been following over the years and I teach with, and it's really important work. Your ethnographies are so excellent. A lot of your work is focused on the southern suburbs of Beirut, especially the group of suburbs known as Dahia. So if you could tell us a bit more about the history of Dahia, and the sort of the complex and the positioning of Hezbollah, not only in Dahia, but also how it's integrated in wider Lebanon as well.
Thank you, Catherine. Yes, I'm going to do this a little bit backwards from the question. I'm going to talk a little about Hezbollah and then come back to Dahia, so we have that history. But so as I mentioned earlier, Hezbollah was founded in the mid-'80s, right, as a resistance force fighting the Israeli troops who had invaded Lebanon multiple times and continued to occupy Lebanese territory. And this was during the Civil War. So when that war ended in 1990, most of the militias that were fighting in the Civil War were political parties before the war, and then they went back to being political parties after the war. And and Hezbollah had emerged during the war. So when it ended, they made a decision to become a political party like other parties in Lebanon. So since 1992, Hezbollah has participated in elections, both municipal and parliamentary, and has done quite well. And since 2005 has held cabinet positions. And as it grew as a political party, it also grew imbricated in all the political machinations that every Lebanese political party participates in. And then since the 1990s, Hezbollah also built a massive social welfare network. Again, they were not the only group in Lebanon to do this. The welfare networks like this are important because they fill the complete absence of any such networks from the Lebanese state. But Hezbollah's social welfare network is probably the most institutionalized and well-organized. So here, Hezbollah functions as a kind of umbrella organization under which you have many institutions: welfare organizations, orphanages, hospitals, low-cost clinics, schools. There's an organization or sort of an NGO of engineers and construction workers that do a lot of rebuilding work. They have an institution for the disabled. And many, many people work in these organizations or use their services. And they're located around the country, but concentrated in the south, the Bekaa Valley, and the southern suburb of Beirut. So for example, this past Sunday, when Israeli airstrikes targeted branches of Al-Qarb al-Hassan, which is it's a non-interest financial institution. So you can think of it as kind of an Islamic bank that does a lot of micro-lending. It's affiliated with the party, but it's a civilian institution affiliated with Hezbollah. And some 300,000 Lebanese civilians rely on the microcredit loans provided by this financial institution. It's literally the largest microlender in the country, right? So the key point here is Hezbollah is part of Lebanese society. It can't be kind of pulled out from it. We can also take the pager attacks on September 17 as an example. The Israeli army would have people believe that they targeted Hezbollah in those attacks, right? That's the narrative. But we have to ask the question, what does that even mean? A Hezbollah member, that could be a person who's a politician, a bureaucrat, an administrative assistant, a janitor, a driver, a nurse, a doctor, a teacher, someone who voted for the party in an election, somebody who canvassed for the party, someone whose family members are somehow work for an organization in the party. It's part of society. Plus, those pagers were also used by people not in any way connected to the party, right? And of course, then when they exploded, they injured everybody around them, absolutely indiscriminately. So now I'm going to shift to Dahia, which again, like I said, is a word that just means suburb. And over time in Lebanon, it became the way that people refer to the southern suburbs of Beirut. And I won't go into the detail there, but basically Lara Deeb has done a lot of work on the kind of history of how the word Dahia came to stand for the southern suburbs in particular. Unless you work for legacy media in the US, in which case you refer to the southern suburbs of Beirut as the Hezbollah stronghold. So those are, and we're also, I think it's worth acknowledging for a moment the time loop we're in. Because I think I was saying these exact same sentences. I know I was saying these exact same sentences in 2006, after the war on Lebanon. And I said a lot of what I'm about to say right now. And my co-author for Leisurely Islam, Musleh, who I just mentioned, has also done extensive research on Dahia and has commented recently on this being in a time loop and constantly having to explain what Dahia is. Dahia is, it grew out of, it was originally some villages, and then during urbanization in Lebanon, in the 50s and 60s, it started to grow into one of many suburbs that run like rings around Beirut. And suburbs here, for an American audience, this is the European version of suburb where they're more densely populated. So think Parisian suburbs, not, suburbs of Los Angeles, when you're trying to have an image in your mind. And over time, they grew more and more densely populated. So, and today, Dahia is not one administrative area. It includes 4 whole municipalities, plus parts of 3 other municipalities. It has informal settlements, there are refugee camps, and each municipality has its own sort of internal politics and relationships to Hezbollah. These collectively include really different, very densely populated neighborhoods that vary by population, class, types of buildings, and histories. And it's probably, my numbers are, I'm going to guess like 750,000 people living in about 16 square kilometers. It's probably about 75% Shia Muslim today, because it not only did it grow into the suburb during urbanization in the 1960s, but during the Civil War, there were massive population displacements, right? So for example, Hatrek, at one of these neighborhoods in Dahia, used to be primarily Maronite. And that population was displaced during the Civil War and never returned. And many of the Shia Muslims who moved into that area during the war were displaced themselves from the eastern suburbs of Beirut and never returned, right? So the civil war created these sort of sectarian enclaves or solidified them in new ways that we still see. But since the war, there have been Maronite mayors of Hathrek who run on lists with Hezbollah. The Hathrek municipality has restored the Maronite church there, and in the 2000s, they were holding mass in that church, for example. So it's more diverse than people imagine. Today, Dahiya's residents also include many precarious populations, like some of the ones that Elias mentioned earlier, refugees, migrant workers, because some of its neighborhoods have housing that is affordable compared to the rest of Beirut, right? So you have old neighborhoods that still have, lovely, huge, massive single-family houses with gardens, and then you have new areas with expensive apartment buildings, and then you have many areas of really densely built, inexpensive, tall apartment buildings, and then you have areas of sort of informally constructed housing, and this is all referred to as Dahiya. So again, to use Hathrek, and I'm using Hathrek partially because I know it well, but also because it's one of the areas that is constantly targeted in Israeli bombardment. It was completely destroyed during the 2006 war, and the same thing is happening again now. We're talking about apartment buildings containing thousands of residences, and then they often have businesses on the ground floor, right? So shops and salons and vegetable stands and a cafe with hookahs and lattes and fruit cocktails. So again, the point is Dahiya is a lively, diverse part of greater Beirut. And when Israeli airstrikes destroy Dahiya, just like when they destroy other parts of Lebanon, just like when they destroy Gaza, they're killing civilians and they're destroying the material context of people's lives and memories and histories in these places, whether generations old or centuries old. And there's a lot more to say about that, but I'm going to pause because I think we're going to talk more about those material contexts, I hope, later on in this conversation.
Yes. Yeah, no, thank you for shedding light on the diversity of Dahiya, which is often not discussed. And you also mentioned the pagers, and Ali, I'd like to turn to you now. Can you talk about how your work is focused on military technologies, from drones to AI, and how they're reshaping the colonial present? So can you tell us about the arsenal deployed against Gaza and Lebanon today, and tell us about what type of war that we're confronted with after October 7th?
Yeah. Israel's wars, or kind of how they approach the question of warfare, has really been formed in encounter with Gaza and Lebanon. And there's really no better expression of that than Amiram Levin's description of how they want to go about warfare in these two places and other places when he was the head of Northern Command. And I want to read something he said here. He says, speaking of Gaza, speaking of Lebanon and other places we'll occupy in the future, since we want to maintain equilibrium as a developed country, punishment as a strategy should be the main element. In punishment, you have room to maneuver. You decide whether to slap them once or twice, in front or from behind, whether to strike property or leaders. But the main objective of units in the field is to kill the enemy. That's the most important thing. Quantity is more important than quality. And then he basically says, most of these people were born to die. We just have to help them.
Can you just let us know when that was stated?
This is from, I think he was at a conference in 2012 or 2013. It's part of a documentary that was published in 2013. I don't know exactly when he said that, but really it's after 2006 war for sure. He's no longer the head of Northern Command. I mean, he's retired, makes an appearance every now and then. But this idea of quantity over quality is really organizing principle of how they're conducting war today. And really the concretization of this logic is really the entire world has learned about it because of their use of artificial intelligence this time. I mean, they use it in 2021 really as one of their tests. I mean, they've been conducting tests for at least 2 decades using high tech like AI. But This time, the use of AI was basically to really do two things: maximize the quantity and speed of destruction. What this means is that they're using technology to generate a huge amount of targets, really to transform Gaza and Lebanon into data that is continuously kind of processed, well, collected and processed, and then categorized into targets. And in the way that, Lara was talking about, really, you don't know who the target is. It could be like anybody who's seen as involved, because really what those machines do is just connect somebody with a name or a location or a message sent from one person to another. You really don't know what the pieces of data that are collected look like, but all of them come together to create some kind of threshold of incrimination such that somebody would be transformed into something like a target. In Gaza alone, 37,000 people were transformed into targets from almost day one. Okay. And just to basically let people know what that means, I would say 4 or 5 years ago, somebody, a military correspondent, was basically kind of complaining about how, or the military was complaining really, how their Gaza target bank is low. It's a ridiculous statement because they've been bombing Gaza really for years. They don't have anything else to bomb, and sometimes they just bomb the same area over and over again. Sometimes Gazans already know what they're going to bomb, right? It's to that extent. But really, it transformed from really low target bank, also intelligence. Their intelligence was capable of producing about 50 targets a year. Now this machine can produce between 150 to 200 targets a day, right? What this machine does is also kind of create a logistical system where targets are categorized also based on weapon system. So really how those targets are eliminated is something that the machine curates. It sends this information to the units with their weapon platforms, and then basically they execute, whether it's the F-15s that drop the 2-ton bombs on Gaza and Lebanon, like the operation that for the assassination of Hassan Nasrallah, which decimated really a whole block, right? But similarly in Gaza. So this idea of organizing warfare around really maximization of destruction kind of reorganized the entire state financially, but also internationally. We're talking about, hundreds of airlifts from the United States in order to just keep sending, right, munitions to Israel. We're talking about 2-ton bombs, half a ton, sometimes, 5-ton bombs. It's insane, but this is how they're conducting warfare now. And just to give people an idea of what those bombs are like, 2-ton bombs that have been used by Israel are really dumb bombs. About 44% to 50% of them are dumb bombs, meaning that they're not targeted. They're just dropped from F-15s, which today are really used as air mules just to keep dropping bombs on top of the heads of Palestinian and Lebanese.
Okay, thank you, Ali. Now, in light of, this is all happening in real time, right now. And Elias, I know that you follow what's happening politically in Lebanon. So could you, what is the response? How is it being processed by Lebanon's political forces? Is it sowing division? Is it inspiring solidarity? Can you give us a sense of what's happening?
Yeah, there's a lot of division. It's uncomfortable to focus on it, and it's scary to focus on it because division could spill out into the streets and people taking things into their own hands. But there's just no way to avoid reckoning with the fact that there's a lot of anger. Hezbollah has been a polarizing force in Lebanon for a long time. It has its supporters, as Lara mentioned. Support for Hezbollah is not exclusively in the Shiite community. It has and its support has risen and waned. It's also not static, right? So there's a lot of people, a lot of members of the Christian community in Lebanon who are big supporters of Hezbollah, Sunnis as well, Druze. Hezbollah is part of the political fabric of Lebanon, it's part of the social fabric of Lebanon. And yet it has, just as it has supporters, it has vociferous critics. And what we're seeing today is, I don't know, from my impression is that the level of frustration, anger, direct animosity directed toward Hezbollah is about as high as I have ever seen it. And in 2005, after the Hariri assassination and the departure of Syrian troops from Lebanon, that was another moment where there was a lot of frustration directed towards Hezbollah. One of the things that helped lower the tension to some extent was a memorandum of understanding that was signed between one of the largest Christian parties in Lebanon, the Free Patriotic Movement, which was founded by Michel Aoun, the last president, and took many Christians aback in Lebanon. I mean, they were shocked at the idea that Michel Aoun, who had been a huge critic of Hezbollah during his period of exile in Paris, had sort of done an about face. But the logic of that agreement that Michel Aoun and his party kind of presented to their supporters was that this is the way that we are going to Lebanonize Hezbollah. We're going to bring them into the fold. We're going to encourage them over time to let go of their weapons, to become part of the increasing part of the state, building the state together. A few months later, there was the July War between Hezbollah and Israel. That kind of cost the Free Patriotic Movement politically, because they were seen as basically aiding and abetting Hezbollah's Iranian project, or they see, Hezbollah's critics largely see Hezbollah as an independent actor in Lebanon that is operating, that is serving Iranian interests, that is not taking into account Lebanese interests, and so on. So that whole vibe, to use a technical term, right, is now, I think there's more people subscribing to that than ever. Certainly among the Sunni community in Lebanon, which has been hostile towards Hezbollah, largely, most people, I would say, since 2005, because they consider Hezbollah to have been behind the Hariri assassination. But, all the Christian groups that have been, the Christian parties that have been traditional opponents of Hezbollah, like the Lebanese forces, like the Kataib, are seeing this as an opportunity. They feel emboldened. They're seeing this as an opportunity to really make their argument and say, this was what we've been warning about for the past 20 years. We've been saying you can't have a state within a state. You can't have an armed militia. It's only going to lead to catastrophe. And this is what we've been saying all along. What's interesting is that now the FPM, the Free Patriotic Movement that had previously been an ally of Hezbollah, is starting to say that too. The head of that movement, Gibran Bassil, who is a nephew of Michel Aoun, gave an interview yesterday where he said, we're no longer in alliance with Hezbollah. We stopped in 2022 when they made it clear they weren't going to join our project of building the state, but also, especially after October 7th, people accusing Hezbollah of launching missiles at Israel without taking into account Lebanese sovereignty and safety and security. So just to answer the question, yes, it's very divisive right now. It's quite scary. We're seeing a lot of signs of, it's hard to guess what the mindset is among Hezbollah right now, because they're sort of in disarray. Have been so many of the leaders have been killed. They're in the middle of a war, so it's hard to get a read on what their view is with regards to politics. But it seems that there has been more and more flexibility over the past couple of weeks. So we're now talking about implementing UN Security Council Resolution 1701, electing a president. But none of that can happen if there isn't a ceasefire. And Israel is not showing any sign of proceeding towards a ceasefire. They have this idea, the Israelis have this idea that that a military objective has to be accomplished, and they don't think that those objectives have been accomplished yet. So that's sort of where things stand.
Okay, thank you very much. I want to remind the audience to put questions into the chat if you have any.
Not into the chat, but to the Q&A function.
Q&A, yeah, sorry, the Q&A. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, the Q&A function. And if, yeah, I mean, I just want to know, do any of the panelists want to respond to any of the comments or that have been made? Rochelle?
I'd actually like to jump in just for briefly, if that's okay. Thank you, both of you. I learned a lot from your comments, and I've been reading a little bit about the technologies, and I find it all terrifying and a little bit unfathomable. So you clarified some of that. And Elias, thank you. My sense is that I think you're absolutely right about the divisions. I just wanted to add two things. One is that I've been hearing the divisions, and I've been hearing the accusations against Hezbollah. And, you know, one of the things that we wrote in the Merit Primer was that Hezbollah is both the most popular and the most unpopular political party in Lebanon at the same time, and has been for a long time. I've also been hearing from people I did not expect to hear it from, a kind of sentiment of, I really dislike Hezbollah, especially in their internal Lebanese politics, but I fully support the resistance against the Israeli attack right now. And so it's also, I think there are Lebanese who are holding that, like both of those feelings or thoughts in mind at the same time. And that we just don't know where it's all going to go. But the other thing I was going to say, and this is about the president, is that I appreciated how you said that we need a ceasefire to be able to elect a president, because there are political processes in place in Lebanon to elect a president. Parliament needs to be able to convene. It's not going to be able to convene until there's a ceasefire. I mean, all of this is happening. And then there's this catch-22, because you also need a president to sign a ceasefire agreement. So it's actually, I mean, Lebanon's needed a president for quite a long time, as you pointed out. And I think one of the things that we haven't brought up that is making all of this worse, in addition to the fact that there is clearly no Israeli desire for a ceasefire, as was evidenced by the surrender agreement they presented to Lebanon that wasn't really a ceasefire agreement last week. There's also a lot of pressure coming from the US, today Germany, saying Lebanon must somehow install a president immediately, and then we can talk ceasefire. You know, again, Lebanon has a political process. It is a functioning democracy. There are lots of problems with it, but there's lots of problems with the US democracy too. And this external pressure is just making this much worse, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right about the Hezbollah being simultaneously the most popular and least popular party. I think that's a pithy way of putting it, and in the sense that it inspires enormous loyalty among people who are dyed-in-the-wool, super hardcore people, super hardcore supporters, who again are not only Shia in Lebanon. There are very, very strong supporters among the other communities, and it also inspires enormous antipathy, and it just like, in a way that the other parties don't as much, you know. And then the other point that you made about solidarity, holding two things in your head at the same time, I think that's also true. I think, you know, the tone that I have picked up on, or the vibe, right, that I picked up on in these discussions is that, like, you know, to a person, the Lebanese are 1,000% against what is happening, you know, not sympathetic to Israel whatsoever, very much in solidarity with Gaza, very much feeling the need, you know, supportive of a defensive resistance to protect their country. Where the division comes in is really the kind of, you know, their criticisms of Hezbollah for all kinds of reasons. There are people who are like, you know, lefty or liberal types who were very angry with Hezbollah back in 2019 during the kind of civil society protests, and you know, don't like them for those reasons, because they're homophobic or because they're this or that, or because they're corrupt or they help prop up a corrupt system. Then there's other people who are, you know, against them because they think that they have a kind of foreign policy agenda that is really it's all about protecting Iran and being a strategic, providing strategic depth for Iran's presence, and that has actually been the substance of a lot of the critiques in the past 3 weeks. It's like, and what people say is that these critiques are coming not just from Hezbollah's traditional opponents, but also from their community, which is to say that, like, where is Iran? Like, if we're strategic depth, we're fine being strategic depth, but they have to cover our back. They have to, like, where are they? And in the meantime, we're the ones who are getting bombed, and Iran's government is talking about how America is a brother, and how, this and that. And so there's a lot of cynicism and kind of paranoia in the country right now about, like, are we being sold as a pawn? Is this all part of the Iranian nuclear deal? Is Hezbollah being sold? There's reports about how, like, why aren't the Syrians involved? Is Russia exerting some kind of influence in Damascus to be pulled into the sort of the Russian orbit and away from the Iranian orbit? There's stories about billboards of Nasrallah being taken down on the Damascus highway, and this is sort of a signal again that, like, Syria's politics are changing. So again, I think this is all what this creates is a kind of dangerous moment where Hezbollah feels increasingly pushed into a corner, being abandoned by some of its traditional allies, and with its traditional opponents sort of heaping on. So yeah, it's a very worrisome moment, I think.
Yeah, I just want to add a few points, because I think the question of division also has to do, and I think more generally has to do with the colonial warfare always has, like, this pedagogical element, in the sense that it wants to punish you for acting, and it wants you to understand that there's a cost for resisting. And really, the Israelis have been sort of like an automaton. Really, you hit, they respond. You try to do something, and then they just hit you in sort of like like the Dahiya doctrine idea was basically just, if you act, we're going to hit you disproportionately. You're going to feel a cost, and the cost is going to be very high. So the insertion of this economy always, through repetition of violence, creates divisions, because sometimes that economy becomes a model of thinking and a model of doing politics. And worse, sometimes identities can be organized around these economies, such that, division becomes around the costs of warfare, end up becoming sort of like ethnic problems. And in many ways also interpersonal problems, because all of these divisions could translate into so many ways of us policing each other in confrontation with the settler colony. Those divisions exist in Palestine, those divisions exist in Lebanon, those divisions, but also exist in the global solidarity movement. And we need to understand, what does colonial violence do to us? And how does it translate itself into behaviors, into fears, into anxieties, and really have some kind of generosity towards each other, to understand that there's a lot of healing that needs to happen as we go about really defending ourselves against settler colonialism.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you, Ali, for that. It's also, I think, important for what you just said made me think about how one of the things that's happening this time in Lebanon that did not happen in 2006, for example, is that Israel is deliberately striking buildings in Christian villages, right, around the country. And there's a way in which the expansion of its targeting is fomenting already existing, and really exacerbating and pushing at and poking at and already existing tensions and political divisions in Lebanon, like the ones that Elias has been talking about. And it's precisely the kinds of the colonial strategies that you were just describing.
Yes, thank you very much. So please do input your questions. We have one comment so far that's asking if this is going to be recorded, and it is being recorded, and we will upload it on YouTube after the event and circulate it. Just to think more about, in light of the conversation, the spatial impacts, which of course are intertwined intimately with social relations and neighborhoods and networks of people. And not only the devastation of the social and the spatial, but also of heritage sites and libraries and archives. And so I'm wondering if someone could speak to some other tactics that are being used to, with questions of erasure and how this, just looking at the different sites, both in Gaza and now in Lebanon. Just this morning, a historic, area of Tyre was bombed, very close to Baalbek, very historical, very important historical sites. So I wonder if anyone has anything to say about that, and maybe that can link to the question that we had in the framing of this discussion of what can the academy do, how can the global community. I think a lot of people feel very helpless right now, and so I'm wondering if there's anything immediate or in long term based on the history and the current crisis that we as a wider community can do to support the region.
Well, I'm happy to respond just briefly. One of the things that's so frustrating and frightening about the current moment is that it does seem like an unprecedented kind of war or set of wars, in the sense that the scale of the violence in Gaza, the techniques of violence that Ali addressed, the kind of involvement now of artificial intelligence, which is something that Israeli media has commented on. This is not something that was originating in the corners of of people of a movement that is entirely anti-Israel. I mean, this is something that is widely known. It does feel like we're on the threshold of just a new paradigm in terms of how wars are waged, and then in Lebanon, the kinds of intelligence breaches that led to the decapitation of Hezbollah's leadership, and then all the targeting that's going on that has violated all kinds of red lines that had been established between Hezbollah and Israel. And we've seen this kind of leading up to this moment too. It's not just that it began after October 7th. So it feels when paradigms do shift, when there's when there's repeated violations, there's a risk of it kind of descending into nihilism, into a paradigm where we no longer feel like we're bound by any sorts of rules, and attacks on historical monuments, attacks on heritage sites, a belief in sort of like a Dahieh doctrine or Gaza doctrine that is grounded in collective punishment, in just wanton destruction, as a way of trying to prevent people from supporting a certain political cause or a political actor. We've seen that doesn't work. I mean, it simply doesn't work. It might buy a few years of peace or stability for Israel, but eventually, unless the core issues are addressed, we see a return of hostilities. So in some ways, that pattern, it does belong to the old way of thinking, but in other ways, I feel like we're in a totally different world when it comes to this conflict, and that's one of the things that's so terrifying about it.
Yeah. And we do have some questions. I don't know. Yeah, Lara, would you like to?
I wanted to say a little bit about you, the first part of your question, which was around the spatial effects, I think. Because, we've talked a lot about destroyed infrastructure, for example. And one of the things we haven't said yet is that, let's say there was a magical ceasefire today. Displaced people, many of them have nowhere to return to, right? And winter is coming, and which will bring cold and rain and flooded streets. And so there are long-term consequences to the destroyed infrastructures as well. We haven't, we could touch upon the financial costs of rebuilding in this world of a magical ceasefire, right? Again, in 2006, Israeli airstrikes cost $3 billion worth of infrastructural damage to Lebanon. Elias has already pointed out how there's essentially no economic, the Lebanese economy has collapsed. I can't even begin to predict the costs of rebuilding in Gaza. I've heard predictions that it will take over a decade just to remove the rubble, right? So it's unimaginable, I think, that piece. I think we also, in addition to heritage sites, right, and you mentioned Sur, the old Sur in Nabatiyeh, a centuries-old Catholic church in South Lebanon, the entire material history of Gaza. There's also these are people's homes and places they live. And so you also have generations of memories that are the material aspects of memories and individual histories, as well as collective histories, right, that are being decimated. Educational institutions, schools, universities, libraries, and we could go on. And I think the last one we haven't mentioned is the environmental devastation, right? Bombing irrigation systems, white phosphorus, an illegal chemical weapon that UNIFIL has documented being used, pollutants that are going to remain in the soil and water for generations. So we're also talking about the loss of agricultural productivity, the decimation of the environment, rising rates of cancer and birth defects. It goes on. And I think, it can feel very, very overwhelming. So to counter that, and I actually want to paraphrase something that Shireen Say Ali said in a webinar yesterday, and I think she was actually paraphrasing a quote from Mesnekato, which is a reminder that one of the things we have to do is continue to listen to Palestinians from Gaza, right? And to continue to hold space for these histories and futures. And that's one way that Gaza will persist. I also, in addition to that, and I think that's an important reminder, in addition to that, I also think that in the academy, there are, first of all, the academy is part of society. So I think everything people in the US should be doing, people in the academy should be doing, including, you don't stop talking about this. And I don't know if I have much hope in pressuring US officials at this point, but I do think we need to still do it. I don't know that it will actually have an impact. But that's maybe perhaps my own cynicism. I do think that in the academy, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement is a place we can be putting our energies, both in calling on our institutions to divest and in ending institutional relationships with Israeli universities and study abroad programs. And there's a robust movement there that many universities are participating in. And it's something we as academics, it's a tool we as academics have that we can use right now. I also think we have an obligation to continue to educate. Sometimes it feels like we're talking into this void, or that the people who understand already understand, and what's the point in doing this over and over again? But I will say, I've had a surprising number of conversations with people in the US who are not in academia, but also in academia, who, for whatever reason, just don't seem to pay attention to the news. And I don't want to say anything about why, but, and are going about their daily lives. And I often have these moments where I'm like, I can't fathom how this is happening. But then I realized that when I talk to them, or I did a teach in a completely non-academic context last week. And then when you do that, you see that people actually do wake up and start to pay more attention. So I cynical as I feel these days, I also think that our educational mission is still a crucial one. And much as it's an uphill battle, not only against Zionist misinformation about the region and ignorance about the region and kind of an anti-intellectualism or checking out that I think is all tied together, I think we have to keep doing it, right? And then lastly, as part of that, we also are fighting a parallel struggle for academic freedom and free speech rights on our campuses and against the militarization of our campuses. And I think that's a part and parcel of one another. And so in terms of what we can do in the academy, I think there's actually a lot we can do, and more of us need to be doing it.
Thank you, Lara. That engaged with several of the questions that the audience have asked. Shall we turn to one another question? Or Ali, did you want to have a chance to speak to that before we go to a question? Did you have anything to follow up on?
Yeah. No, it would be great if we can attend to some of the questions.
Okay, great. We haven't talked, there's a question about Syrian refugees in Lebanon. They're now often forced to return to Syria under Assad's brutal control. And so I wondered if you could please comment on the Hezbollah-Assad relationship, the transformation of the Syrian-Lebanese border under heavy bombardment as well, and the contradictions of Hezbollah's resistance narrative.
I'm happy to take that one. That's another sort of uncomfortable part of the conversation here, in the sense that a lot of the Syrian refugees in Lebanon are among Hezbollah's biggest critics, or harbor a lot of antipathy towards the party because of what they perceive, well, not what they perceive, because of the fact that Hezbollah joined the Syrian civil war on the side of regime forces, and participated in some of the often brutal attacks on civilian areas, on that involved practices like barrel bombing and alleged chemical weapons attacks, and so there's a lot of hatred among those communities, and the degree of animosity is attested to by the fact that one of the rare moments of consensus in Lebanese politics over the past couple of years was around the issue of the need to send Syrian refugees back to Syria. This is the one issue that all Lebanese parties could agree on, right? For different reasons, of course, right? The Christians had a demographic concern, there's all kinds of so there's all sorts of agendas going on here, and Hezbollah, of course, is acutely aware of the fact that there's a lot of hostility among these communities towards Hezbollah, and so that's another thing that complicates things here in terms of the status that Hezbollah will have following this war. Will there be some kind of national reconciliation process? Will there be an election of a president? Will there be the implementation of UN Security Council Resolution 1701, which requires not only something in the short term, ceasefire, withdrawal of all Hezbollah troops, all armed groups except for UNIFIL and the Lebanese army in the south, withdrawal, of course, of Israeli forces, but also a long-term solution, which involves the end of Israeli overflights and surveillance in Lebanon, as well as the disarmament of Hezbollah, of all armed groups. That seems so far-fetched, right? But that is kind of like, that is the solution that the US is putting forward, though that is the nature of the agreement that has been presented, which nominally, the Lebanese government has accepted, including Hezbollah. The question is whether anything like that will happen. But formally speaking, at least, the Lebanese government has accepted that framework as the way of ending this war. And I think the American vision here is that, and this is a vision that many Lebanese actually have spoken about publicly, which is that we will always remain committed to Palestine and the Palestinian cause and dignity and freedom for the Palestinian people. But we want to be able to do that the way everybody else in the region does, which is to say, we want to be able to do that morally, we want to be able to do that economically, and support in the way that Jordan and Egypt and Turkey and all the other Arab regimes do. What we don't want to have to be asked to do over and over again is to contribute militarily to this conflict. It seems like the Lebanese are the only ones who are engaged in a military struggle here. This is the kind of vision or a proposition that is being addressed or being put forward today in Lebanese media, and it's one that the European powers and the Americans and it seems even Russia and Syria are now buying or are now sort of behind. So that's an answer to the question about the Syrian refugees.
Okay.
I want to add just a couple of things, which is also that's the vision in one of the visions, that the 1701, but also we have Hochstein, who went to Lebanon a couple of days ago and basically presented from the Israeli side, sure, you can have a ceasefire as long as Israel continues to control Lebanese airspace and is allowed to operate militarily freely south of the Litani River. right? So basically concede Lebanese sovereignty and we'll give you a ceasefire, which is not a ceasefire proposal. It's a surrender proposal, right? So it's, which also suggests, I'm not disagreeing, I'm not contradicting you. I'm saying it's adding a piece of information that there's also no evidence that the Israeli state is at all interested in.
Yeah, and I think
applying any of this.
Yeah, I think you're right.
But then the last piece too is that for 1701 to work, the Lebanese army would need to be functional and supported and be able to actually defend the southern border. And so I think that's another complicating factor here. And so there's a lot of, yeah, sure, we'll do this, but, you know, many questions arise around, you know, will Israel allow the Lebanese army to become a functional army that can defend the southern border? Where is that support going to come from, et cetera, et cetera? So I think, as Elias said, it's on the table, but it's not a kind of realistic short-term vision that we can imagine.
And as you said, there's no indication that Israel is willing to accept that framework without what they're calling an addendum, which is we get to continue to do our overflights, we get to continue to do our targeted strikes. So we're going to continue what we're doing, but in the meantime, you take care of 1701 and all that stuff. And there's, you know, some Lebanese commentators have also pointed to the fact that like Israel has recently told UNIFIL to get out. And they've said, you're in danger. We're issuing you a notice. You need to move because we have work to do here. And people have raised the question of like, if UNIFIL withdraws from the Lebanese border to a distance of 5 kilometers, which I think is what the Israelis are asking for, does that mean that that 5 kilometer belt is going to be occupied by the IDF as a kind of no man's land, and that they're not going to leave even after the implementation of 1701? And I think that this is something that I don't want to give the U.S. government or Hochstein, you know, too much credit here, but I do think that this is something alarming from the perspective of the U.S. government, that Israel would feel, you know, because of their successes at like going after Hezbollah in this particular war, that they would feel drunk on power, that they would reestablish an occupation in Lebanon, which we have seen has been disastrous for Israel time and time again, and that the U.S. is somehow trying to rein in Israeli ambitions in the south of Lebanon. We've seen Netanyahu hold up maps of Israel that show part of Lebanon as part of Israel. There are people who have spoken publicly in Israel about the need to conquer the Upper Galilee and so on. So I think that the U.S. is somehow, I get the sense that the U.S. is trying to rein in these territorial ambitions, this sort of like expansionist project. But it's just been shocking how little leverage apparently they have, or how little willingness they have to actually bring about some kind of a ceasefire, both in Gaza and Lebanon.
And it's more than, it's Netanyahu holding up that map. It's this demand for the bottom 5 miles of Lebanon. It's also, you know, there's a movement in Israeli society that believes southern Lebanon is part of greater Israel, and there's a website. They're selling houses in southern Lebanon. And there was a recent Jewish Currents article about this, actually, that I just saw. They posted public spaces in Israel with signs calling for the settlement of Lebanon. They've planned out the Hebrew names that will replace Lebanese village names online. And again, like this, you know, we can call this a fringe movement, but I think it's important not to just dismiss fringe movements, because first of all, the Zionist movement prior, you know, to 1948, at the end of World War I, when the mandates were being set up, the Zionist movement was lobbying unsuccessfully to have the region up to the Litani River included in the Palestine Mandate, right? So that it would then be included in their Greater Israel project, because they want the waters of the river. Ben-Gurion has repeated that as inspiration across his career. He repeated it. Again, that aspiration to include the Litani River in the Israeli state. And, you know, the history of Zionist expansion and settlement in the West Bank, now in the Golan Heights, that's a history where over time, and actually Ali talked about this in Gaza as well, what seems to be a fringe movement, slowly, with one settlement at a time, becomes the process by which illegal settlement takes place, right? So I don't know that we can, I think I hope you're right that the United States is trying to rein in these aspirations, because I think the aspirations are fairly public at this point, and fairly clear. And I go back and forth between thinking the United States is unable to rein them in, or this is actually part of a United States, like the United States is fully behind this and does not. And again, when we talk about the United States, I mean, we're talking about the Biden administration, we're talking about elements of the, right? So I think it's the state is a big, complicated structure, but yeah.
Okay, we have 3 minutes left, and all of your answers have engaged with the question, several of the questions that have come in. Do we have one more question, or does anyone have anything they want to follow up on, Ali? I am very interested in Ali's work about the embodied experience of sounds that people have to experience during war. And when I talk to people from the region, and this is something that comes up time and time again of not being able to sleep, just the sounds of crying, and Ali has actually written on this. So I'm just wondering if you have anything to say, because I think we all need to be listening right now to what they're are going through and are forced to listen to.
Yeah, sure. I mean, for decades now, the Israelis have been really trying to occupy our time through spectacular means of violence, through really occupying our senses one way or the other. Sonic booms over Gaza or Lebanon is a big part of it. The endless droning of unmanned vehicles over our heads, feeling that you're constantly being surveilled, and there's this unflinching eye that is looking at you and will determine at any moment that you can be hit or struck, at their whim. These are things that Palestine and Lebanon have been living with for a while. Those things really animate for those two people's experiences, recall events, recall traumas, and in ways that really kind of, let's say, kind of as if they're hacking our nervous system, really, over and over again, and treating fear and all these things as if they're neural implants that they can just play with through different means. And this time it feels like the whole war is just about overwhelming us sensorially, physically, mentally, in such a way as to feel like there is, for them to retrieve really a feeling of omnipotence that they lost in October 7th. And this sense of vulnerability now that they felt for a few days is being translated into this endless stream of horror, right? That in order to punish those two people, especially punish Lebanon for not leaving Palestinians, to experience this alone, for anybody, really. I mean, I have a lot to say to this, but we don't have a lot of time. But this is also something that we need to interrogate to really see what violence, because the affective, let's say, ballistics of this genocide are really hitting not just only people in Gaza and people in Lebanon, but all over. And the splash pool, let's say, is global. And we need to be able to think about and reflect on those experiences, really be able to see how they affect us and to understand the consequences of this terror on us, and be able to really interrogate this in our day-to-day interactions with each other. Because, being able to put a limit to their violence, to stop them from their designs of conquest and settlement, and everywhere they imagine they can just put a settlement, they're going to place it, or everybody they're going to kill, they just kill them. Our ability to put a limit to that has to do with our ability to understand what we're going through. Genocide now today is becoming sort of like this global, experience of becoming, and I don't know where it's going to take us, but we need to be able to, as scholars, but also people engaged with politics of today, to orient a new emerging us that is refusing this to really put a limit to it, if not stop it.
Okay, thank you, Ali. I think that's Lara. Very quickly, because we're out of time.
Oh no, I was thanking Ali for those comments. That seems like a
Yes.
really appropriate place
Yeah, I
to
think
end.
that's a really appropriate way to end. And I send my very best wishes to everyone who's terribly impacted by the situation. And like Ali says, it's all of our responsibilities to listen and to continue our efforts and doing whatever we can to support each other. And I have to say, Laura, I enjoyed your cats in the background. I thought it was very nice, actually. And I'd like to thank all the panelists. I really appreciate everything that you said. I've learned a lot, and let's keep the conversation going.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks
Thank you all.
To the
all for
audience.
coming.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.